Brought to you by Hawaii Food Service Alliance and Domino's Hawaii.
We know that there's going to be a body count.
They call it a disaster for a reason.
Communities all up on the right into the valleys, all at risk of being cut off from resupply.
We first were kind of introduced to what happens at the state in a natural disaster through Hurricane Iselle. Because we're in logistics, because we're in food, we're always tracking the hurricanes as they come across the Pacific towards Hawaii. And so we are mobilizing our staff, we're mobilizing product, and we're working with the Coast Guard and others to make sure that we get into harbor and off the ships prior to a hurricane going, because we know that the food supply is going to be strained tremendously.
It's going to be a problem if we don't have clean water, if we don't have enough foodstuffs, because you can't fly enough in.
It really is going to be dependent on our community to organize. What resources are in place? What kupuna are there that may not be able to get out to get food?
It's going to be bad if you're not prepared. It's going to be bad even if you are. It's going to be hard.
In the case of a significant natural disaster like a Category 3 or 4 hurricane or tsunami, is my professional estimation is the state is very poorly prepared for such an instance of a significant natural disaster.
Turn to the other breaking story tonight and take a look at the big screen right behind me here. That little circle right there, that is the eye of that monster storm, Tropical Storm Iselle, as seen from space tonight, a direct hit on Hawaii.
So watching Hurricane Iselle, it was a Cat 1 heading towards Hilo. What we did know is that we were going to have a community in need. And so we showed up immediately after Hurricane Iselle and realized that there was no state functions going on, there was no FEMA functions, no Department of Emergency Management or Civil Defense, and there was an entire community of Puna, Nanavali, and some other areas there that were dramatically hit by Hurricane Iselle as it made landfall.
We've always known that if a big storm hits, a 100-year storm, and it takes out a big part of Oahu, we'd have great difficulties feeding our people, providing health care, and so on. So I felt it was important to get out ahead of a crisis, to partner with the private sector. We want to do that.
And one of the things we're really excited about with the new administration and the new leadership at HIEMA is working on an actual plan, working with private industry, with HIEMA, with the Department of Emergency Management, Civil Defense, to be able to work together and make sure that our communities are as safe as they possibly can be after a major natural disaster, especially as we're moving forward toward the age of climate change, sea rise, and more extreme weather that we'll be facing as an island chain in the middle of the Pacific.
I think our greatest challenge now is the lack of resiliency throughout the system. Building redundancy, taking a look at the coastline, it validated our vulnerabilities. You look at it, you know with the storm surge, it's going to hit those neighborhoods. That storm surge is going across the main road into these valleys. What I noticed too is, where's the hardened structures that I can fall back to, that these families can fall back to, that we can shelter? There's not a lot.
Hey, Corey. It's an interesting process when you first engage state and government that have never collaborated with private, and so they don't understand what it takes.
We do between 80 and 100 containers a week coming through here.
We feed Hawaii day in, day out, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And government doesn't do anything like that. And so not engaging us, not working with us, not collaborating with us is absolute insanity.
We really don't run large feeding operations at the city. And it makes it difficult when it comes to emergency management sometimes, but it's difficult with food because that's not a normal day-to-day government activity where we're pushing out food into the community. And so that's why these partnerships with the private sector are really important, because they're the ones that do.
We'll have a food shortage, we will have people isolated and struggling. We'll be focusing on things like cleaning out the roads, getting people from point A to point B. So having private sector trucking, having private sector businesses that are ready, perhaps with stockpiles of food, really makes our lives easier.
So we have emergency generators for all these facilities, so if the power goes out, we have the ability to keep running and keep things cold.
How do we empower the people that do it every day to be more ready, more prepared, and work with us in an emergency?
Pesha Hawaii Kuleana is to the people of Hawaii. The Kapalama Container Terminal, which you see behind me here, is 30+ years in the making. This will be a very efficient terminal in the future, and it will be long-term for Hawaii's benefit. Over 80% of what we consume in Hawaii is imported, and more than 98% of everything we import comes by ships. So we, as Hawaii, are so dependent on marine-borne transportation. This is a vital link to the state of Hawaii, and everyone will benefit from this for generations to come. In the future, other terminals will follow this model that's been built here. The design and engineering will become a model for other terminals to copy, because we will be able to operate without the grid in the event of a natural disaster. We'll have battery backup storage, we have crane regeneration, we'll have micro wind walls that generate power, as well as solar power on all the buildings. So we will have the ability to operate this new terminal in the event of a disaster that knocks the grid out. We can't do that today at the current facility. There are a number of benefits to this new terminal in the event of a natural disaster. One, we're on the Makai side of the Sand Island Bridge. So if there's a big tsunami or a hurricane with storm surge, it might take out Sand Island, but we're further Mauka with Kapalama Container Terminal, and it's also built 3 feet higher than any other pier in the state of Hawaii right now. So that added elevation on the construction of the pier height is to take into account sea level rise in the future.
Private industry resupply is we already resupply Hawaii twice a week, every week of the year. And so the biggest concern for waiting for FEMA is communities that don't have food are cut off from resupply. And so you have mothers and fathers who can't feed their children. The government is without food supply. And now that mom and dad, or those families in those communities who can't feed their keiki or kapuna, hit a whole nother level of concern and unrest as they take to the streets and do whatever they can to feed their people, as they're, I think, struggling to understand why the government failed them at every level, at county, at state, and at federal. And so resupply immediately is absolutely essential to keeping peace across our island.
Not until 1982 would Hawaii see serious damage caused by a hurricane. Eva hit the islands as a Category 1 hurricane.
I was born and raised out here. I grew up on a beach loop in Makaha, and when Hurricane Eva hit, I remember my mom evacuating us and holding me and my sister's hands, and the water level was just up to our waist, and she was trying to hold on to us. You know, Waianae is a very rooted community. We take a lot of responsibility on in making sure that our neighbors are prepared. You saw that at our community meeting the other night, where people came out and we were all very interested in setting up a resiliency hub. As you probably heard, we can't just have one, and community members were very vocal about that. We need to have one in each of these ahupua'as, because there are people in every section of this coast who are going to require help.
How do we address the communities that are geographically predisposed to being cut off after a natural disaster? The first community that comes to mind is Waianae. So if you take from Kuleana up through Waianae, you have roughly 50,000 people that live in those communities, all of whom will be cut off because the road is literally along the coast. And so we put together a plan. We established what we call a recovery pod that has 200,000 meal packets in it with a 25-year shelf life. Those are there specifically to feed the community and help work towards resupply, but at least have something there for the community.
So this is the state's first pilot project for a pre-recovery pod. Essentially, this Matson container stores about 200,000 servings of food for community use and in times of natural disasters. There is an emergency that is happening out here every single day for a lot of community members who don't have food. They're not going to think about storing food when they don't even know what they're going to eat tomorrow. At the same time that we're planning, that we're also encouraging our farmers to grow more food and that we're supporting them. So when we have monies to purchase food for emergency feeding, we're purchasing the food from the growers right in our community, because the goal is grow more food, because when we get blocked off, this is what we have. We have this, we have the food that's going to be in the ground and the food that's being stored in our community houses right now that we've been able to help put in place.
Entire communities get knocked out of power. In our conversations with HECO, after a major natural disaster, a lot of their attention, if not majority of their attention after making sure things are safe on their live power, is coming back through here and getting these transmission lines back up and running. But what that's going to do is it's going to cause the majority of their staff working on the main transmission lines, the public's not going to know where HECO's at and why aren't they in my neighborhood, why aren't they working on getting power to my house. And the answer is the majority of that staff will be in here reestablishing these lines, connect the grids to bring power back to the island.
We take preparedness very seriously. The key is to try and make it as resilient as possible. There's no way to make sure the infrastructure is 100% immune to any type of disaster, natural or otherwise. When you look at the electric system as a whole, there are certain components that we really need to address first and in a specific order. Then you've got the main transmission lines, which will go from the power plants, go across the mountains, through the middle of the different islands to reach the different communities. In many cases, if you don't see our crews working in your neighborhoods, it's because that they are working on repairs further up the system, possibly up in the mountains, out in the forests, up in the hills somewhere away. And those lines need to be repaired first in order to bring the power from the sources of generation into your neighborhoods. So there is a specific order and process. It's a long linear system and there are many steps involved. And if you don't see crews working in your neighborhood, please be assured that they are working on other parts of the system that are essential to the restoration process.
Hawaii right now has over 7,000 miles of above ground wires connecting the communities. They have a tremendous amount of work to do.
And so part of the hope is bringing this to the public's attention that without these arteries, nothing's going to happen between power plants and into the different communities.
And that's probably a message that needs to be heard for the population to understand why they're not here. They're doing bigger things in the mountains to turn the communities on. But there hasn't been to date, to our knowledge, any communication to the communities that that's the case. As we were getting involved with the plan and putting these plans together, unbeknownst to me, Naval Postgraduate School came into Hawaii, heard about what we were doing and started to engage with us. The advantage they have is knowing and having those inroads into the communities that kind of come to them. So it was really exciting to have all that horsepower or brain power and all those PhDs show up in the room and start working with us and start putting the plan together, because they too are unaware of the infrastructure necessary to feed Hawaii.
So the specific thing that we've really been focusing on is really where are we going to try and move food and water and potentially fuel and other resources if there's a big disruption. Have all the details for what operations look like for like an infrastructure system, like how we're going to do last mile distribution, and try and model where people might go, how they might try and access things, to then say these are the locations that are best for serving those communities. So through our conversations, we've come up with potential pod locations that could work if FEMA were doing its normal operations. the kinds of things that you see in mainland for some previous disasters.
The independent report from researchers at George Washington University reveals 2,975 people lost their lives due to Maria.
A significant natural disaster like a Category 3 and above would largely disable this island and therefore interfere with the ability of other islands to import food and other key commodities. One of the forthcoming findings of our research is actually identifying geographically where we see the higher rates of vulnerability in terms of a lack of disaster preparedness. In summary, only 12% of households statewide were prepared with adequate amounts of food, water, and medicine in accordance with the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency recommendations. In addition to that, thinking about building greater resilience in the food system and disaster preparedness system of Hawaii, the collaboration between the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency and the private sector is an additional layer of resilience building so that the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency can help coordinate the private sector to get essential resources to vulnerable communities in the case of some kind of significant event.
You know, the ER doctor in me will tell you this. You always want to prepare. The first lesson that they always taught us in our training program before you were doing a surgical procedure was lay out all your tools, be prepared, spend most of your energy on that so that when you're doing the procedure, when there's suddenly a bleeder or something is, you know, a little bit more scary for people, you're quickly on it. And so I never let that lesson slip out of my brain. So I'm still using my ER mind as governor, but this preparedness is kind of a reflection of that. I do assess a crisis quickly because of the years in the ER. I can quickly tell where our greatest vulnerability is, and I know how to take quick action. But it is kind of an instinctual thing for me as a doctor first, rather than perhaps as a governor.
I look at where we should be focused in emergency management, and my job is, in terms of emergency feeding, is making plans for the most vulnerable people in our communities who are least able to do it for themselves. Like, that's where our energy should be going in terms of making sure we get to those people quickly. And we are not going to be able to do that if it's most of the island that's run out of food by day 2. And we're not able to focus on the most vulnerable because we're focused on everybody.
We're really pushing for resiliency throughout the community. We're working on a response plan, and we know we need a recovery plan. We got to work closely with our county partners. Our counties, that's where recovery and a response will take place, is at the county, in the communities.
As a result of this meeting and the contact list that we were able to form, we will be contacting community and to really understand, like, where are you located? Who's in your neighborhood? Like, who has what? Do you have a chainsaw? But that's the kind of values that our community has, is really being a lookout for each other and jumping in when needed.
This morning I'm driving in on H1, and there's a sea of cars going east and a sea of cars going west. And I think to myself, how many people in these cars and their families know that there are no resources in the case of a natural disaster? How many people in these cars just going about their business trust government like there's a plan, like we've got our act together? Because it's completely wrong. And there are no resources currently. There's very little plan. We're working on a plan. But I think it's important to know, if I could get any message to the public right now, they need a plan for their own home. No help is coming. It's going to be weeks, if not more than a month, for resupply to show up. Worst case scenario. Again, this is a Cat 4 or 5. But if you love your family, if you're caring for your family, it's really important that you take the responsibility and bring some goods into your house. It's potable water and food supply to make sure you're going to be okay. Because as with Maria, if you're counting on federal government to step in, or to feed your family immediately, it's not going to happen.
What you can control is how bad it's going to impact you and your family, but you got to do it now. You have to do it now. And really, like, you know, I tell our staff sometimes, like, we could be the best emergency management agency in the world, like everything I aspire to, and all the city agencies, but the key of how well we do after a disaster is going to be how well the community is prepared to take care of themselves and each other.
Disasters come in, if we're getting blocked off from providing food here from Waianae to Nanakuli or Makaha, food needs to be in place. So those resilience hubs are going to be super important. So it can't just be this recovery pod here. While we are pretty central in Waianae, the roads get closed off and we're not going to be able to access those community members.
And we got to have that plan in place that we recover and we come together and, you know, pull together and get through this.
We've created a hybrid approach to governing. We rely on these relationships in the private sector, and we want to know what they can offer in their area of expertise will do better than what we can do.
And what that means to us here in Hawaii is if we don't have a plan that addresses and feeds our keiki, feeds our kupuna, takes care of our families after a natural disaster, we're going to have another entire world of civil unrest and things we need to be worried and concerned about. So getting this plan together, collaborating together, working hand in hand with government, private, and philanthropic entities to work and really pool our resources together to make sure that we have the most robust plan possible in the case of a natural disaster.